Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the EFL Fantasy Podcast. My name is Angus,
My name is Dan.
and we're here to review the game week 3 action. Feels like we're getting a little bit more into the sort of actually into the season at this point, although, as we'll cover later, still chaos while the transfer window is open. But we'll go through sort of our main takeaways from the game week 3 action and answer your questions in a fashion where our answers will probably become significantly outdated by next game week. But that's just the way it is. But first things first, Dan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, Angus. Green Arrow in Gaffr. We'll get into that. Luton, we're not bottom. Thankfully, Cardiff um, didn't win today. So, yeah, hopefully Luton will get a win next week against QPR and we'll go on the international break a little bit happier.
Yeah, it's a little bit weird having this sort of initial sort of run of games, but initial run of like 4 game weeks, and then it's like, okay, international break time. But yeah, so we'll do sort of the normal thing. We'll go through how our teams did, then we'll cover the team news. We'll go through over some of the main games we want to talk about, um, sort of the other action, and then answer your questions. So I'll go first in terms of this game week. I got 77 minus 4. Um, I might take a hit for someone playing in the Friday game every week now. After had you right last week, it was Dan James this week, and he returned. I thought it was. I will say, I think it was a harsh booking, given that he sort of like was half pushed, half walked up to the fans, and some of them grabbed him, and he got booked. But I had started Davies knowing that he probably wouldn't play with Hazard on the bench, who came in for 6. Firpo for 6, Engel for 3, captained Doughty for 14, Perez 4, James 9, Azaz vice captain for 15, brought in Hamer as well for 2, Joseph for 12, Latela for 5, and Wright 1. It was Dan James and Gustavo Hamer in for Jack Clark and Josh Windass for me, so that's hit worked out as well. Green Arrow, we've sort of been discussing today actually. Rank only matters so much at this point, particularly with the number of boosts around. So I'm sort of focusing on how I'm doing points wise and everything. But I think at this point, I mean, I'm 161st without having played a boost. But I feel like my scores have been good, my sort of picks have been good. So yeah, all in all, I'm really happy with the way I've started off. Um, how did you go this week?
So I got 83 minus 4. My transfers were Clark and Azur out for Dembele and Kole-No-Sho, who no-showed this week, so he might be on the move. Didn't hear any rumours about him, so I thought it was safe to pick him, but obviously not. Um, I captain Latte Lath for 10, vice captain Doughty for 10, Jensen, clean sheet, 11 points. Never doubted him. Bogle, 9 points. Pickering, who came in Kole-No-Sho, 4 points. Ailing, 3. I had Azaz for 10. Dembele, 10. O'Hare, 2. Joseph, who, if he didn't start Friday night, I was going to take him out. So I'm glad I didn't. That's 12 and more, 2. I got a green arrow up to 307th, which is I'm quite happy with because I basically cut my rank quite near enough in 3. So quite happy. Like you, I haven't played any boosts, so I'm just starting to figure out what I'm going to do with that. But yeah, overall, pretty happy with a green arrow.
Yeah, I mean, any week you can get a green arrow is a good week, regardless of how like much or little we think rank counts at this point. It's still sort of, a green arrow is a green arrow sort of thing. Um, but yeah, so obviously positive weeks for us. Next up is coming back to you for the team news from this week.
Yeah, so the fantasy relevant team news for Sheffield Wednesday, Valentin was in at right wing. Um, Ugbo was still benched. Leeds, Harrison was in for Piero. For Hull, Burstow played up front instead of Estupinan, who I think it sounds like he's going to be leaving the club. Millwall, Tanganga was in for Hutchinson. Obviously, he was um, suspended for the first few games after a red card last season. A new signing Aziz was on the bench for Bristol City after getting the winner. He kept, Twine started. QPR new signing Madsen went straight in the side along with Sato and Smith. Plymouth Obafemi was on the bench. Blackburn Ohashi came in for Gay. Oxford have made a few changes. Kioso, Al Missouri, Phillips were in for more. Brannigan and Plijeka. Borough Deutschstiel was in for Van der Berg. I think this meant that Ayling played in centre back. That's what the heat maps were showing. Portsmouth, Swanson, and Sorensen were in for Shaughnessy and Silvera, who obviously couldn't play because he's on loan from Middlesbrough. Um, Sheffield United, Trusty and Suter were in at centre back. Armahodvic and Robinson wasn't in the squad. I think Armahodvic is maybe something to do with transfer, and Robinson, I'm guessing he's just injured. Preston, Kesler Hayden, and Keane was in for Brady and Ledson. So they went more to like a 3-5-2. Luton, Shea was in for Kaminsky, and new signing McGuinness was in for Walters. Sunderland, Mandel, it was in for Clark, obviously Sol. Brown and Ballard were both back on the bench. Burnley, Masengo, Trafford, Hutaday were all, Egan Riley were all in their squad when you compare it from the first game against Luton to this game was a lot different. Cullen, O'Shea, Kole-No-Sho, and Veghorst were just some of the players that weren't involved. Kuma started up front for Stoke. Watford Lurici was in at left wing back, and Derby Zetterstrom was in goal, and Yates was back up front again after his suspension. So yeah, um, quite an eventful team news, and I'm sure it's going to be just the same next week.
Yeah, especially when you've got the mix at the moment of some injuries, some transfers, some who've come in and are still building fitness and all this sort of thing. So makes it nice and fun. Um, but yeah, so we'll get into some of these games. First one that I'm going to talk about was the Friday night game. Sheffield Wednesday 0, Leeds 2. Um, as you say, particularly sort of, I guess interesting for Leeds in terms of Aronson starting, but he got the opening goal, followed up well actually after. I think it would have been a penalty um, if he hadn't scored. Joseph was fouled by I think it was Valentine, but Aronson managed to finish it well. And then the second goal um, early in the second half, a great pass from Mateo Joseph to release Dan James, and he goes to lift it over the keeper and definitely mishits it, but gets enough on it for it to go in the goal. Um, I think early on, Sheffield Wednesday um, had some had some good play. It was certainly more at the Leeds end than the Sheffield Wednesday end in terms of Sheffield Wednesday having more of the sort of forward play. But once Leeds got the opener, they had control for much of the game. And I think for quite a while, Sheffield Wednesday struggled to really get sort of a foothold back in the game. Um, I think this was more along the lines of what we would have expected from Leeds. Um, I think, it's an interesting one in terms of players that people are looking at. I think um, from this game, I know we've sort of talked about the fullbacks. Um, so far from this game, it felt more of like Bogle was more involved than Firpo, but we've sort of seen that go back and forth. I think they're still both options. Um, Aronson was actually one I considered, but I did buy James, and I think both of them, along with Nonto, probably options at this point. Like I know Nonto got booked in this game, didn't sort of in blanked, but I think he's shown in the initial games that he could still be an option. I know they brought in Ramazani, the winger. I think they're linked with another wide player, so um, that might sort of affect things a little bit. And Joseph, we'd obviously talked about, he hadn't done much the first couple of games. I thought he was better in this game. I think the only thing he really did wrong was he had a chance in the second half that he sort of blazed over the bar in a decent position. But I thought he was really good in this game. Um, Disappointing for Sheffield Wednesday, I think, but um, tough game. Um, I know they are looking to still make additions to that squad. You can certainly see there's a couple of key areas where they could do with,
Centre mid.
yeah, with another player, centre mid being the one they're crying out for. I think there's a decent chance of them getting Shea Charles on loan from Southampton, which could help them in the middle of the park. Um, but yeah, I think generally quite positive for Leeds. I think a lot of people will be looking at their Leeds assets and be relatively happy with them off the back of this game. And yeah, I think it just Dan James I think is the premium mid now still left in the game, which is quite funny in that regard. But um, yeah, I think the only sort of negative was at times I got a little bit frustrated by the way Gruev was playing. I thought there was a little bit too he was slowing it down a bit much at times. Like I know he can dictate the tempo, but sometimes it felt like, you know, everything was quicker before and after he had the ball. But in general, I thought it was a good game for Leeds. I don't know if you watched this or if you have any thoughts on these two teams.
So I wasn't able to watch it live, but I did sort of watch the highlights back. Um, as I mentioned when I was going through my team, I did seriously consider taking Joseph out for a -8. Um, I didn't in the end, basically because Sheffield Wednesday got hammered the week before. So I thought it's probably not the wisest move. Um, I think Bogle and Firpo are going to be fine. I think there's only them and Sunderland who have kept more than one clean sheet so far. And we know the attacking potential of both fullbacks. So um, yeah, I'm happy to keep Bogle for a while, unless you're planning like an away days or something. Um, Not really thought of James. I would definitely prefer James and Nonto, especially with all the up in the air with the transfer. Um, I do wonder if Aronson long term will keep that cam position, because I know he sometimes frustrates the Leeds fans. You only have to watch the last 2 minutes of the Portsmouth game for that. But I think if he plays there, he will get attacking returns, and he's fairly well priced when you consider you think Leeds will probably be one of the so-called three or four, probably, even though they've lost all these players. Um, yeah, Aronson is 7.5, so that's when you consider James is 9. That's quite a nice little save. And um, anything on Wednesday, Angus? Obviously, you had that great game with Plymouth. Everyone got a bit excited about them, and rightly so, because they played well. They've now played Sunderland and Leeds. You could argue are probably um, well, Sunderland at top and Leeds could well finish top at the end of the season. Are you worried about them, or are you looking at any of their assets? I know you did have Windass.
I'm not worried. I think, it's tough to measure them. I think we've seen that Sunderland with their start, it's like actually maybe that was a worse game
Yeah,
than we thought. Um, but and then sort of like, you then have Leeds, which is tough. Um, I think, that first game still counted, even though I think, you can't sort of completely write that off in terms of like, they still put in that good performance. But I think it sets the platform now of like, okay, they've got a couple of those tougher games, sort of they've had them now. They've, you now you have to show us something. Um, and so I probably wouldn't be looking at them for the moment. Just sort of while I wait to see a bit more from them. But I think in the fact that they've got sort of Millwall away, who aren't the easiest, but you'd expect to see a little bit more from them. Then QPR at home, you'd want them to sort of show you something in that as well. I think before they have a couple of tougher games again. So I think it's one of those where probably not looking at them, but just sort of almost keeping an eye on how they're doing um, after these first few games.
yeah, I think I'd agree with that.
Um, so yeah, so that's Sheffield Wednesday and Leeds, which was a fun way to kick off the game week. So coming to you next for I think it's Borough against Portsmouth.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so I know I think we've covered Borough and Portsmouth before, but I think it's quite fantasy relevant, and there wasn't too many goals this game week, so I wanted to talk about Borough again. Um, Quickly got to start off with Portsmouth though. Sadie getting 2 goals. The first from a Swanson assist. The second was just a bit of a comical mistake. The goalie and one of the defenders clashed into each other, but he was still there to finish them off. Obviously, I saw them live last week, and he's a handful. He's a big, strong boy up front. Um, but yeah, he's getting a couple of goals as well. In between that, you had Matt Clark scoring a decent header from a set from a Finazaz corner. So it was nice for Finazaz to get a return so far. Um, and we then had, I thought Norris was excellent in goal, especially in the second half. He denied Borough quite a few chances, a few great saves. He done the same in both the other previous games against Leeds and Luton. Um, and then they did finally find a way back in with Jones winning the penalty. And interestingly, it was Conway who took the penalty rather than Latte Lath, which probably, well, it's definitely disappointing for any Latte Lath owners, especially in captainers. Um, if you look at the stats, um, I know Borough had the penalty, but they nearly hit an XG of 3 again, um, and Portsmouth having an XG of 1, and basically one was an open goal. So um, they're picking up points, Portsmouth, but I think in all 3 games, um, they've rode their luck quite a bit. I think on another day they could be sitting there on 0. So yeah, it's really hard to work out Portsmouth. I think they're okay going forward, um, but I would still be targeting Portsmouth. I think, especially with they've still got a few fixtures coming up: Sunderland next, then West Brom, Burnley, Sheffield United. Um, all of those teams I wouldn't like even remotely consider not captaining against Portsmouth. I don't know how you feel about that, Angus.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of their attacking numbers are a bit unsustainable, but at the same time, they've shown they can get these goals and everything. But I think targeting them the other way is very it feels very
Yeah,
viable at this point, and so I think yeah, armbands against them, particularly I think when teams are at home against them, it will be one of the big ones. Um, as you say, they did still have like get the point from this game, but I think yeah, it's tough, and I think Norris has obviously made a very good start to the season. Um, you do wonder a little bit um, how sustainable that is. Not saying that he's bad, but some of these saves he's pulling off, it's sort of like, okay, but you're not going to keep all of them out. But yeah, I mean they've picked up some points, and you know, in what is probably going to be first and foremost a season about staying up, getting
mm,
points on the board is what matters. I think I'd had a conversation with Luke Irons about um, Azaz, particularly because I think the previous game he'd got top bonus without returning, um, and so it's sort of pleasing to see him do well again. Um, I would say there's a little bit of a concern about them defensively, but I'm not sure there is. I think they're looking at one or two changes, but I think even sort of one or two of their issues have come when backup players have been on the pitch, which I think the fact they're missing, I think it's three centre backs at the moment. Um, you wouldn't necessarily expect that, but I think they've done well so far. Um, and I think yeah, any sort of concerns about players from them, really?
it does
Mm,
maybe a bit on latte left, but they've still got a few nice games. Cardiff, Preston. I think the next two might give them it, and then they play Sunderland. I think that might be the time to maybe reassess. Look, I'm not sure I'll have both Azaz and Latte Laugh at that point. Um, as you mentioned, defensively, like you think of, they didn't really have um, any trouble against Swansea keeping the clean sheet. Against Derby, it was that terrible mistake by
yeah,
Jones where the Derby player ran through, I think it was Jackson, and
played Kaiser
rounded him.
Jackson in, yeah,
And then I know that the first goal was a good finish by Sadie, but the second one's just another mistake. So if they stop the individual errors, they're going to start getting clean sheets. But we've said this for a while, Angus, because they've over since Carrick's been there, they've conceded a lot more goals than they should have. Um, but I'm not worrying about Ayling. I'm more worried about Ayling playing centre back than I am about, like, I don't really want Ayling playing centre back.
yeah. I mean, I think Vandenberg. I think it's very minor. Like, I think he's going to miss the League Cup game in midweek, but he
Yeah,
might well be back next week. And I think him being back would be key. Um, and I think yeah, you've got these sort of individual errors, but they're potentially looking at addressing one or two of these spots as well. Like I think one of them comes because Engel charges up out of defence, and he's had good and bad moments, but they're looking at bringing another left back in. At which point, like, does that help that situation? That sort of thing. But um, yeah, I think in general, you know, Latte Lap, I think the interesting thing with him is he's done decently for key passes in every game, which wasn't necessarily something that would have been expecting, but um, I can see people at a certain point starting to move away from him. Um, but sort of no urgency at this point to move off them, I don't think. Um, but no, I thought it was interesting. I thought they did well. It also felt like the one thing I will say for them, it felt like a game. I know they got the equaliser very late, but it felt like the sort of game in the early period of last season they would have lost. Um,
Yeah, I think that's fair.
and so I think that's at least an improvement for them. Um, yeah. So the second game that I wanted to talk about, um, I have already lost. Which game it was? Bristol City Coventry. I should have known because it's the game I sat and watched. Um, Thought it was interesting. Um, it was a bit of a strange game for a while, but I thought there was clearly some quality on both sides. I thought Bristol City played quite well. Twine was well involved. Bird had good moments. Um, you could tell like comfortably Coventry's sort of best moments or best sort of periods were when they got the ball to Hadji Wright. He was giving Tanner at right back all sorts of issues. I think a couple of the other players didn't give you as much as you would have liked, and it felt a lot like it was either going to be come from sort of getting the ball out to Hadji Wright and him making something happen, or Van Evijk on the overlap and he gets a cross in. But they were struggling a little bit even to get on the end of those. Um, so I guess there would be an element of concern there, but obviously there's still some positives in terms of like those things are still sort of replicable. We've seen um, for them sort of Casey Palmer obviously got the equaliser off the bench. After an absolutely brilliant finish from George Tanner. Uh, I think it was his first goal at Ashton Gate, and that's some way to get it. Um, but I think there were some interesting things, particularly for people looking at players from both of these teams, which is part of the reason I wanted to sort of talk about it. Um, Tanner obviously got the goal. It was an absolute screamer. I thought Pring was an interesting one. We've talked about Pring before. He was very high quite often, and he was getting on the ball quite a bit. There were a couple of times where he sort of found people in space for shots from range. But I think he's sort of an interesting option. Um, I think all of the attackers sort of had moments. Twine when he got on the ball. You had sort of Bird. I think again we've talked about him, and I think it was another encouraging performance from him. Sykes was staying quite high and wide on the right and getting the ball in some good positions. Uh, Armstrong is a player I'm conflicted on because he does well. He runs well with the ball. He pressures people well. He's big, he's strong, he's a focal point. But a lot of the time, when it comes to time to put the ball in the goal, you're not really convinced he's going to do it. Um, so yeah, mixed feelings on him. But I think that they have got some interesting players. Um, on the other side, Coventry, Van Evite stood out again. Hadji Wright stood out again. Sims was quiet again, which is there's a little bit of pressure on him now. Uh, you know, they could put right through the middle, but they've got Thomas Asante, and they've signed another forward, Bassett, I think. So bit of pressure on him just now. Palmer obviously came off the bench and got the goal. I think that was when they went a little bit more attacking. He came on for Torp, but at that point, um, Mason Clark on for Sakamoto pre-60. I think Sakamoto was a bit quieter in this game than we've seen before, um, which was kind of a flavour of some of those Coventry players in general. Um, I think it's one of those fixtures though where both teams will probably come out of it relatively happy with a draw. Um, but happy to sort of hear any thoughts you have on either of these two. I think they're two quite interesting teams, which is probably why I also wanted to talk about them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Interesting. Was Twine on set pieces before he came on?
It felt like he was.
So
But
you've
I
got
struggle a
three
little
key
bit at
passes.
times because the camera at Ashton Gate, the TV camera, is on the moon, so
Yeah,
it was a little bit tough at times to tell who exactly was.
yeah, because he's got three key passes. So I wondered if he was on set pieces. Um, as you mentioned, Pring is something that normally does quite well. Um, I can see what you mean with Armstrong. I think we've known since he broke in that QPR, he's a bit unpredictable, but he has got a high ceiling. Um, but yeah, I've predicted Bristol City to finish just outside the playoffs, so I think they're going to do well. They could even get in the playoffs. Coventry, it feels like they're still just trying to work out what is their best system. It seems like Hadji Wright is probably their best option and most reliable one if you're going to go. Redoni, though, seems to play a lot. He's quite trusted already, so I know he's been frustrating and he's not got any returns, but he's doing all right. Venner is someone that if you've got a period of games, you just get him in and just play him every week because we saw last game week was he goal and assist,
Yeah.
and he's quite capable of that. So I don't have any of them currently, but I think throughout the season I can see myself going for like a Twine or Pring for Bristol City and two or three commentary players at times as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly options there. I think Van der Eyck, there's something about I think it's quite simple in terms of like a lot of the time he's trying to find Hadji Wright at the far post, but he is quite good at, even if there's only a couple of bodies in the box, finding one of them or at least giving one of them a chance. So yeah, I do think he will pretty routinely be an option. Um, but yeah, I think there's certainly options from these two. How exactly you feel about them at any given moment depends, but I think it does mean that there's a number of options depending on things like as we go along, which position you're looking at what your budget is at that moment, etc. Um, but yeah, so that's sort of Bristol City and Coventry. So you've got the interesting one both for the game, but also to talk about to sort of well, I guess it's technically on field, but also off field in terms of player movement. Sunderland against Burnley.
Yeah, so going into this game week, they were the top two. I know it was very early in the season, um, but I think a lot was taken away. Obviously, Jack Clark wasn't in the squad and moved either the same day or pretty much. You then had Burnley, who, like I said earlier on, it's night and day that their team from the first game week, through whether that's through transfers, gone transfer speculation, or injuries. Getting into the game briefly though, um, best player on the pitch was Mundle, who came in for Jack Clark. And it was just like watching Jack Clark, especially for his goal, where he just cut in and on his right foot and hit it bottom corner across the keeper. Um, he also created two big chances as well. And I think he's 5.5, although he might get a price rise. It doesn't take a lot for players at that price to go up. If he keeps that position and if he keeps playing that well, that's a bargain that will be in a lot of teams. Interestingly, Brown didn't come straight back in for Rig. I did wonder if they'd want to get the experience of Brown back in, but they didn't bother. Um, Ballard again was on the bench, not thrown straight in, whereas previously that he would have probably just walked straight back in. So that shows a lot of depth for Sunderland. Um, like I said, the overall though, it wasn't like a massively entertaining game, but Sunderland were by far the better side, and Burnley. had an XG of 0.13. I think Lyle Foster header was the only key chance they showed on the highlights. So um, yeah, I've been really impressed by Sunderland. They're the only team to have kept 3 clean sheets from 3. Um, and Burnley, it feels like this next week is going to massively determine how well they do this season. Like, can they keep certain players and that? Um, Angus, first off, Sunderland. Do you have any, and how many are you going to get in quickly?
So I don't have any. I definitely want some though. I think I'd particularly be looking at someone like Sirkin. I think a slight preference for him over Hume in fullbacks. I think Sirkin offers a little bit more going forward. Um, Mundell, I think, is interesting. Patrick Roberts, I still think is interesting. I know I mentioned him last week. I do like Chris Rigg, and what I've seen. I didn't see as much of this game, but what I saw last week, I really liked. Um, but I think the first port of call for me will probably be Sirkin, and then go from there.
Yeah, I think there's probably just a bit of question mark about Mundell and Rigg. They're quite young, whether they will stay in the team. Patrick Roberts is probably the safety one if you want to go in. Bellingham, I think, is continuing the same role, so he might be a little bit deeper than what he is when Brown plays. But yeah, we mentioned last week they've got options all over the pitch. For Burnley, Angus, I know you've got Perez. He's done brilliant the first 2 game weeks. Obviously, it's not a sell after this game. But are you like a wait and see for Burnley until the window closes?
I think so. I think particularly because we're being struck with these sort of surprise ones. We had the Odebear one. We have Kole-No-Sho. Um, it seems it's all swings and roundabouts. Like O'Shea scores in the first game, then doesn't play as he's on the move. Um, that sort of thing just makes it all a little bit like, okay, I'll come back to you. We've got the game week 4 deadline is a few hours before the window closes, and then it's an international break. So it's almost like, unless you're really sure that a Burnley player is going to be there, it's sort of like, okay, I'll sort of wait and see sort of where we're at. I also think there's been a couple of question marks about the performances, which makes me feel a little bit uneasy. Even we talked about how weird the Cardiff game was in terms of how well they actually did versus the scoreline. You've got this game where it wasn't good, and so I do think there's a little bit of like, okay, let's see. Um, beforehand, and like I said, the fact that we've got the international break feels a little bit of an opportunity to reassess at that point.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Um, Not that I'm happy about already having an international break. I just think it provides that
Yeah, I know.
opportunity. um, but yeah, so I think that's the main games we wanted to talk about. Obviously, there's points to take away from the other games as well, particularly as we've covered slightly fewer games initially this week. Um, I'm going to mention the other game that I at least had on, or one of the other games that I at least had on, which was QPR Plymouth. Um, I worried initially for Plymouth. It was very early goal after a big chance for Smith, I think it was, who went through one-on-one, really well denied by Hazard, and then immediately from the resulting corner, um, really good header from Frey from a Dembele corner to make it 1-0. And at that point, I worried a little bit for Plymouth. It was sort of like, oh God, this could be bad. Like, um, I thought they actually came back into it quite well. Um, and had evened the game up a little bit. And then Whitaker, obviously, like he just plays basically a give and go off the QPR player, and gives
It
it a
was Field, wasn't it?
yeah, and just gives it a smack, and it flies in, which all credit to him. Um, but I think it all changes and it makes it hard to assess with like a minute afterwards, particularly after you've done well, you've got yourself back into the game, you've got yourself level, and almost literally the one of the main purposes that Adam Forshaw serves in that team is a little bit of veteran leadership. And he decides to get his second yellow. And it's a daft challenge to go in for. It's on the
It is,
touchline.
yeah.
There's no need to even make the challenge.
I was trying to stick up for him as well, weren't I, Angus? But
Yeah.
I couldn't even do that.
Um, and he gets it all wrong. He times it all wrong, gets sent off, puts them on the back foot. And basically from that point on, I mean, Plymouth did okay, but it was basically the Conor Hazard show. Um, he had an incredible game, as I tweeted out, for all the people who sort of like, particularly who are new to the game, who are wondering why everyone likes Jeepers Keepers so much. Conor Hazard had, I think, 35 points, a
Yeah.
9 save game. And so just all credit to him because I think without him on another day, like they lose, and I don't want to sort of be too negative towards them in terms of we talked about their level of performance because I think it was just, you know, for a little while they were all right. It was just then as it went further along, the longer you've been playing with 10 men, the harder it gets. And I don't think I'd be too concerned if I were QPR either. Like they did everything but put the ball in the goal. And so I think, that there are enough positive signs there for them, but it was just sort of particularly mentioning Conor Hazard, I thought needed to be done after this one.
Yeah. I want to mention that we've been skeptical of Rooney, but what I will say is that Plymouth team are definitely playing for him because
Yeah.
if they wouldn't, they'd have got hammered quite comfortably in that game. So it did make me laugh because they obviously equalised and he's getting all excited, Rooney, and they're celebrating, and then you could just see him. He was raging with when Warshaw got got sent off. It's quite interesting though. He's quite quiet on the sideline, don't you think, Angus? Like the camera flashes at him and he's
Mm,
just there. And do you know what I keep thinking? Like he must just be thinking, like, what are these players doing? Like when you consider his level of football, and it must be quite hard when you're like being right at the top of the game and you've dropped down a level, and you know that like you used to be able to do a lot of this, and you've got to be quite patient. Um, but yeah, like I said, they got hammered the first game week. They um, got a point against Hull the second one. They've showed fight to get a point away, 10 men against QPR. So yeah, they're definitely competing. Obviously signed up Femi, who for a couple of seasons lost his way a bit, but if he gets up and running like he was at Swansea, he could get double figures as well. So for QPR, I think um, that front three behind Frey is definitely a lot more dynamic than it was under Gareth Ainsworth, 12 months ago, and you've still got Chair and Anderson who weren't even involved. So yeah, I know QPR only have 2 points, but they play Luton, so they'll probably be on five by the end of next Friday. But yeah, anyone for QPR? I've got Dembele, and I thought he was excellent.
yeah, I think he was good. I was quite impressed by them in general. I think you could make an argument. I think for Jimmy Dunn. We've talked about Jimmy Dunn before. I think
He's
particularly,
attacking, isn't he?
yeah, and he's always that threat from set pieces as well.
Mm.
Um, I thought, Smith had moments. I'm not sure he's reliably going to be in it. I thought Frey did quite well, but I think if you look at defensive, I mean Dunn or you could go up to Pal. I think they both were in the bonus for this game. it might just depend on sort of your budget and everything, which a lot of people have the extra budget at the moment, so maybe you go for Pal. But um, yeah, I think they've got a few options at the moment, I think.
I'm going to mention the Blackburn game against Oxford. Um, Probably the main talking point. I know Blackburn won and they done. It was quite an even game, but they got it over the line. But Harris's goal, we mentioned Tanners. Um, so he gets chested back. I think it's by. I'm trying to think. Is it by Phillips? Chests it
I
back.
think so.
First time Harris was it all he control. I can't remember it, but he smacks it and it goes top bins as well. So we got Tanners or Harris. Who are you going for, Angus? Which one's better?
Harris just because of like the distance, I think. But I loved all of them, but I'll go for I'll give the edge to Harris.
Yeah. Anything else, Angus? I'm going to mention Preston Luton. Obviously, Heckingbottom in didn't change too much. He brought Keane in. Brady, I think, was ill or had a niggle. That's why he didn't start. For Luton, just very frustrating. Like we shouldn't have lost the game. Adebayo's now missed six big chances this season. Um, Dowie's just a bonus man. He's on everything. Um, I do think if Jordan Clark stays, he's been quite creative from open play. So I know you're probably not running to get Luton players at the minute, but I do think we should be on more. We should be on 4 points at least, but it's just not scoring. So I know a few people have asked about Adebayo and Morris. There's probably it's still a slight chance Adebayo could leave, but when the window closes, if they're both in the team, Adebayo I think is worth a point five more if you want to go.
Yeah, that seems fair. The other one I was going to mention briefly was Swansea Cardiff today. Quite enjoyed it. Um, enough feisty moments. It's always a good one in terms of a derby. You're always good for at least one sort of group
100%.
altercation. Uh, uh, but Cullen again scored, giving them the lead. Really sharp, sort of following up. I think it was Ronaldo who had the effort and followed up. And then in the second half, Robinson with a really good finish to make it 1-1. Um, After good work from Tanner, who then nearly suffered a really serious injury with fans sort of running forward. And I think because they're separate from the stands, some of these advertising hoardings aren't as sturdy, and so
Yeah.
they've sent it over, and it's gone on his leg, and you could see sort of a mark down his leg. But thankfully he was all right. Um, but I think it was, it's always one of those things where, particularly for a game like that, you watch it because there's going to be a bit sort of feistiness, a bit of niggle all the way through, and there certainly was. Um, I think it was a bit more of a positive, I think, for Cardiff in general, because I think they'd struggled a little bit so far. But I will give a special mention uh, in a negative sense to Perry and G. In him and Harry Darling late in the game go head to head, and they just sort of stood head to head. And this is the difference between someone like, we'll call it the gamesmanship of Brereton Diaz in the Premier League on Fabian Schär. Um, Darling and Ng are just stood head to head, and then Ng falls to the floor, and they both get booked um, for sort of going head to head or whatever. The problem was with Ng is he didn't wait for any sort of forward movement from Darling. They were just stood head to head, and he dropped to the floor. So it just looked ridiculous. You're not going to succeed in getting him sent off. and it really didn't work. Um, and so, yeah, I just wanted to say, if you're gonna do that, like, you've got to execute better. That's an execution problem for me. So yeah, I wanted to mention that one as well because I thought it was a poor effort.
Just briefly in this game, I thought the subs made a massive impact. Swansea went more and more defensive. Bear in mind they were really in control in the first half,
Mm,
and in the second half, Baloo brought on a lot of attacking players. I thought Cole will actually look decent.
yeah,
Sometimes he can flatter to deceive. I thought he looked good. You mentioned Tanner looked good. Um, Robinson obviously got the goal. Um, yeah, it just the subs and the Swansea one for Luke Williams, who you think is normally quite an attacking manager. He brought on a lot of defensive players and quite early on as well. So um, yeah, Cardiff off the board, still bottom, but they got off the board. So yeah, I think that's it. Angus rounded up.
yeah. Apologies to anyone whose teams we hadn't mentioned. Um, you know, that's just the way life is some weeks. So we'll get into your questions now. Thank you to everyone who's sort of sent in questions for us. The first one is from Chris Hermitage, and he said, assuming Leeds are one, which three defences would you look to have long term? And saying, is Maja one to target given their next four fixtures? He's managed to sort of sneak two questions in there. Um, so I think in terms of sort of the defences that you'd look at in general, um, like there's some of them that are relatively self-explanatory. Like he mentions Leeds. I think as it goes forward, you would look at Luton. Um, I think you would,
I mean, just Doughty. It's just him.
yeah,
Even for attacking, he's on everything.
yeah. Um, Burnley, I still think going forward, you'll probably look at, um, and West Brom. I think just a Corberan team, you're always going to tend to look at the defence from them.
I think you've got to mention Sunderland as well.
Yeah,
3 games and decent fixtures, tricky fixtures as well. So
yeah, yeah, very much
yeah, I
so.
think those. Maja,
Maja,
I've been burnt so many times
West Brom
by West Brom.
forwards.
I mean, if you're gonna do it, the runs now.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it wouldn't be for me personally. Um, I think he's had a flying start. I think we've seen it with Maja before that he can be bad just as quickly as he's good. But um, I think yeah, if you're gonna do it, it's now. Like it's not a case of waiting. It is now.
Yeah,
Swansea home, Portsmouth away, Plymouth home. You could maybe say Sheffield Wednesday away, but if they've settled a bit more, and I think they will probably be better at home themselves anyway.
yeah,
But I do think certainly the next three, like if you don't do it now, you're not going to buy him. So I think it's just making that decision, like you say. Um, FPL Shaka Zulu has asked. He just said, before the start of the season, I had asked you to group the teams into four tiers of six each. Now that we have had 3 games of data and big transfers, could you share your tiers now? Thanks.
right.
Um, I'm going to respond to this in two different ways, neither of which quite answers the question. He did say the tiers were promotion contenders, upper mid table, lower mid table, relegation battlers. Point one, can't remember the tiers I gave on the first time I answered this question. Point two, for me personally, 3 games, particularly while the window's still open, isn't enough to reevaluate. Um, there's like yes, we've got some data. For me, we haven't got enough data to sort of really reevaluate where we're at with these. I don't know if you have anything you want to change on yours, but given that I can't even remember what mine were, I'm probably not going to be able to give much on this.
There's probably a few teams I'm higher on. I think Watford's are going to be better.
Mm.
Hopefully not as good as where they are now. But
Yeah, you had them right down near the bottom, so that sort of makes
Yeah,
sense.
and I think Sunderland. I think I think it'd be interesting to see how they do with Jack Clark, but I do think their first 11 in each position is quite strong. It's probably top six, and it's just can they keep that up? And I think they probably can. Blackburn, I think, are probably better. I'm not sure about the overall squad, but I think that with the manager that they're better. Um, am I worried? Am I worried about anyone? I'm trying to think who I had. Like even Luton, like I'm not particularly worried. I know that sounds crazy, but I've watched the games and I think on another day we could be on 4 or 6 points. I don't think I'm pretty happy with what I've said so far. Um, I think I'll give Oxford. I think that they're competing better than I thought they would. They could still end up near the bottom though. But yeah, it's too early at the minute. It really is.
Yeah. Um, James Wood has asked, with Clark and Rutter leaving, managers have a lot more budget to play with. What's the play? Spread the money across the squad to raise the quality, or focus the money on mid or key premium players? Who are the key players to build the squad around? So part of the problem with a lot of this is it's a lot of the premiums that are leaving. So, it's almost like you do still have to make a decision on these, but less of a decision, I think. I think it's still for me about sort of identifying those best teams and who you want from them. Like even for me this week, I bought Hamer and Dan James, and part of it for me was I had the money. I was selling Jack Clark. I'd sold Rutter before, but it was like he was one that I thought would be significant from one of those teams that is still one of the best teams. Um, Hamer, I think, was the one that everyone has sort of said they wanted from Sheffield United, and so I think he's probably one of the more significant ones, particularly if he doesn't move in the next week. That I think a lot of people will be looking at. I think maybe not Dan James specifically, but I think one of these Leeds mids. I think
Yeah.
it will be sort of a staple in a lot of teams, whether it's James, whether it's Nonto, whether it's Aronson, whether it's sort of Ramazani. Um, think Doughty. If Doughty's still there, Doughty obviously will be a key one. Um, Probably a Burnley defender. I think it remains to be seen a little bit. Sort of Vitinho is another one that's been linked with a move away, but someone like that as well. Um, but yeah, I think otherwise it's a lot of there'll be a lot more flexibility I think for to adjust to good runs and that sort of thing. But I think there's sort of a few sort of staples that you're going to want to have throughout. I don't know if there's anyone else that you would throw in there.
Uh, Probably not. It's the same though. It's just we're gonna get the best players. Unfortunately, a lot of the premiums have left. Um, I think some of them we didn't really. I honestly didn't think Rutter would leave. Clark, I could see Somerville probably did think. Um, we've still got quite a lot in like the not 9 and 8 million, which if they all perform well, you're gonna have some decisions to make. But yeah, it's just because everyone's cheaper, you probably will be able to spread the funds around. Although I'm not a fan of that because I hate benching headaches. I'd rather have basically just 13 players uh, or like 12, just one sub you sort of chance bring in and out of your team. But yeah, I can't see any team signing like a really big signing that will make them even a premium. So it's
Mm.
unless is the only team that will probably do it are Leeds, I think. who could
Or
sign like
Burnley, just with the amount of
yeah,
turnover, they could add someone.
yeah, someone who's going to be 10 million plus, and even then they probably would have had to have had previous in Gaffr, so we so we sort of knew how, how to price them.
Um, but yeah, I think it's not sort of many that you're really going to be like, oh yeah, I definitely want them. But like for example, I went with Abdullah at the start from Swansea, and I'll be quite happy to keep him because it's just one less player I have to think about, like you
Yeah,
say. Um, but yeah, Gaffer Hoops has the next question. He said, "Which teams do you suggest we should be focusing on given the upcoming fixtures, e.g., next 4 games?" Cheers, gents. That's a very good question. Um, West West Brom, I think, are one.
yeah.
Uh,
I think
Um,
Bristol City.
yeah, Burnley.
Yeah, they got that. It's hard because of the transfer window and then Leeds, but I think once you get to six, you'll
Yeah,
probably know where they are.
um,
So you can don't say
Luton.
it.
Luton.
I
Gonna have
know.
to
I
say
feel
it. Like,
really. I know.
um, I think it's one of those where I think any transfer decision at the moment, to be honest, you're probably factoring in Luton. Even if you don't go with them, it's a team you have to look at with those fixtures. Um, and I mean, there's
Yeah,
not many others where it's sort of like, oh yeah, great set of games. Um, I think those are probably the main ones. Like I don't think, particularly the way they've played, I don't think someone like Sunderland's games are terrible. They're not great,
yeah.
but they're not sort of terrible, so I wouldn't necessarily be put off by that. But there's not many others that I'm looking at like, yeah, I really want a piece of those fixtures. Um, Ron Mukherjee has asked best replacements for Clark and Rutter considering the next 5 fixtures. Um, so I guess specifics from those teams. Um, well, I guess you could say Adebayo. I know you're sort of very much now Adebayo over Morris, which I think, um,
It's just six big chances. Like it's just
yeah,
always in the right place. So,
um, I think. I mean, there's a couple of games still for Hadji Wright that I think actually in attack aren't that bad. Like even something like Norwich at home that you wouldn't immediately think of as being a great game, I think is still a decent game for someone like him. Um, like Kiefer Moore, they still have some decent games. And if
yeah,
you
they
like
do.
like we said, if you're going to go Maja, it's now. So um, and then Clark, um, Fellows, West Brom, Hamer. Um, Anyone else you want to add into there, Dan, on in either of those positions?
Just from what I saw, Dembele, QPR. If he stays in the side, I know he might not stay on set pieces when Chair comes back, but yeah, he was so live. He was involved in everything. So maybe Dembele.
And I do like Scott Twine. I considered getting him
Yeah, I
this week,
agree.
but it wasn't the right
Yeah,
time. But I do think with that decent run, he could be an option. Um, Petrianen has asked, how do you rate Fellows? Good fixtures, 14 points last time, and FF Joel bought him. I did spot that Joel bought him. Yeah, we talked about Fellows quite a bit last season, and I think
I
we
like
both really
those.
like him as a player. I think it was a decent sort of purchase this week. I felt like Johansson could actually possibly have done better on his first assist, but um, he's one of those players who seems to always make things happen, and they've got a good run of games. So yeah, seems perfectly good option.
I think last year we were worried about rotation a bit. Is Dean Garner back?
Yeah.
That would. I know they're playing. It has Fellows got to the level where he's becoming like the main man. Like
So I'm just looking at specifics of yesterday. So Fellows. He played 69 minutes before being replaced by Jed Wallace, who is also back. Um, yeah,
See, that's what.
Diangana came on at the same time for Carl and Grant, but then went off, so he might have been injured. They've got Dobbin to come into the team, you would assume, given that they brought him in on loan. Um, I think there will still be rotation, but I think he seems to sort of feature quite prominently for them, at least so far.
Yeah, yes, yeah, yeah. I like Fellows as an option. Like if I was after a West Brom midfielder, that's who I'd go for.
Yeah, yeah, I think very much so. Um, AD Tour, with Foster having more cards than goals, is it time for him to be moved on? Um,
Things like that. I don't think he's going to go though, and they have still got that run. I know it's pretty similar to if you've got Adebayo or Morris. It's
yeah,
not great, is it?
it's frustrating, but at the same time, it's like, you know, if that's your only thing to deal with and you're that sort of bothered by it, then go for it. But like, they do have some decent runs coming back, like particularly after the break. Obviously, they play Leeds, but then they play Portsmouth and Oxford and Plymouth and Preston. Like that's their four after the Leeds game after the break. So you know you would probably want attacking players in that game. So I understand the sort of the frustration with him. It's just whether you want to sort of keep going for those fixtures or whether you just want to get rid and do something else, which I understand both sides of it. Um, Eric Nessonstad, what to do with Sims? Sick of him, the other forwards, Joseph and Latte Lath.
If you're sick of him, it probably just be good for you to just get rid of him.
Yeah, I mean, I said like he has been quite quiet, so yeah. I think we've covered quite a bit on forwards, but if you're sick of him, then yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to sit here and tell you to keep him. Um, the artist formerly known as FPL Glasto has asked us top couple of assets in each position going forward, considering fixtures. We've done a lot on midfielders and forwards, so I don't think we need to do more of that. But goalkeepers and defenders. I think
Mm.
goalkeepers is interesting because I think a few people probably have been looking for goalkeepers or might be looking for goalkeepers. Um, we've talked about Cooper before, who I think is probably one. Um, I'm going to throw O'Leary in there. We've talked about Bristol City. Um, I think he's sort of a decent
Patterson
option.
with the clean sheets. I know you might not want three Sunderland, or you might do, but
Not
you
the
might not want
keeper.
the keeper.
But I still think he's an option. Like I think you might decide that there's better sort of options around, but I do like him as an option. Um,
I think the best 4.5 is probably Norris.
yeah.
I know I've been a bit critical of them defensively, but I think long term he's going to do quite well, Norris.
Um, I'd possibly, particularly if you're looking shorter term, maybe say Zetterstrom.
Yeah.
Um, just because I think, I mean, he seems to be a decent keeper. We'll see whether he is, but I think they have slightly better fixtures. So just in terms of like, I think both of them will probably have to make saves, but just in terms of probably slightly greater chance of, a clean sheet sneaking in there. Um, maybe say him. Defensively, um,
Sirkin for me.
Sirkin, uh, Furlong, I think is one to consider again at this point. I think Burrows showed a little bit more of what we hoped in this weekend's game. I think he had a couple of key passes, was forward more, so maybe someone like him. Um, but yeah, I think it's a lot of the same sort of team, same players, I guess. Uh, Erica Malone has asked, this week has been a disaster. We'll use overhaul this week. Some players you think I should definitely get in my team. I think we've covered quite a lot of those. Um, but yeah, maybe there's an opportunity to take a couple of punts in there as well. We've got a couple of other questions. Bluebird Adam, our Cardiff correspondent, asked before today's game, and I'm going to read it just to, make him feel better about it, saying, does Cardiff winning their derby game 4-0 make you want any of their players? um, no, although I do think, as we said, there's a couple of players that could be interesting depending on how they do going forward. Um, and Aaron CPFC has asked Luton Town, what the fuck? Um, which I think we've covered. I'm not going to make Dan uh, have to live through talking about it more. I do think we'll go with a quirk of sort of results rather than performances. Like you say, things like some of the key pass numbers for Doughty without sort of as many returns, the big chances missed from Adebayo, you'd expect that sort of thing to almost sort itself out.
Dominating Portsmouth, and then Kaminsky decided to go Ninja Kaminsky. Um, yeah, it's one of
um,
those that we need the window to close, get a couple more players in, make sure we've got everyone, and then see where we are.
yeah. So speaking of that, that's all the questions. That's everything for today's pod. Um, we'll be back with you in the aftermath of game week 4, which will also be when the window is closed. Deadline. I can't remember exactly when the transfer deadline is on Friday. I want to say it's 11 o'clock.
Yeah,
Um,
so for two transfer windows in a row, Luton have had a game on on the transfer deadline day, so I'm
yeah.
not sure Luton would be doing much on deadline day.
So I think it's what, a 7:30 Gaffr deadline on Friday.
Yeah,
Um,
I think they're all 8 o'clock, aren't they, on
yeah.
Friday nights?
So I guess a few nervous hours for people after that, both in terms of if you've got Luton and QPR players, but also in case any of the players you've got a deadline end up being sold. Um, but we'll sort of be back after that to sort of do the game week review, but we'll also have an opportunity at that point to talk about sort of what's happened in the last week of the sort of transfer window. I think we'll make a decision whether we do that all in one pod or do a slightly sort of separate one about the transfer window, but it might fit in um, with that, I guess, partially depending on how interesting or not the games are in game week 4 as well. Um, but yeah, that's everything from us for this week. Unless there's anything you think I've forgotten, Dan.
I think we've covered everything.
Cool. So we will be back with you either late in the week or start of the following week. Thank you for listening and goodbye.
Bye.